Before the wars and before the plagues, there was the hunger. It began not with thunder or famine's trumpet, but with rain, relentless, gray, endless. The villagers of Eslan, tucked deep in a valley where the forests met the fields, marked the days not by saints or sunrises, but by how long it had been since the baker's chimney had last smoked. A thin sheet of frost clung to the windows, framing the world outside like a cruel painting. Inside one cottage, the silence was deeper than the cold. An old woman sat by a dying hearth, her hands cupped around an empty bowl. She wasn't praying, she wasn't crying, she was remembering. Across the village, the same story echoed in different homes. A child sleeping beside an empty sack of oats. A man boiling shoe leather over coals. A mother cutting a single apple core into slices no thicker than a breath. This was not a winter of storms. It was a winter of waiting, of watching the world forget how to grow. And in that forgetting, a memory was born, a memory so sharp and quiet. It carved itself into every soul who lived through it. It is here, in the hush before despair, that our story begins. In the year of our Lord 1315, the sky above the village of Eslan ceased to be a friend. It no longer brought the promise of spring showers or the gentle warmth of summer light. Instead, it opened wide like a sorrowful mouth and wept, not in torrents or storm bursts, but in an endless gray drizzle that soaked the bones of the earth and the souls of those who lived upon it. The villagers, accustomed to harsh winters and lean harvests, did not panic at first. They waited, as their fathers had done, believing the sun would soon return. But the days passed, then the weeks, and then the months, and the sun remained hidden as though ashamed. The fields became lakes, the roads disappeared beneath sucking mud, the rivers swelled over their banks and turned the outer farms into shallow swamps. And beneath the surface of it all, the roots of every living thing began to rot. Wheat sprouted too early, turned yellow, and collapsed in clumps. Barley bloated and blackened inside the husks. Even the stubborn rye, the last to fail, grew bitter. The harvest that year came early, not because the crops ripened, but because they had to be pulled before they vanished completely beneath the wet earth. There were no full wagons, no smell of threshed grain, no songs in the field. Instead, there was silence, and from silence, dread. The rain did not stop in autumn, as it should have. It deepened. The air grew colder, heavier. The fog crept into homes, wrapping itself around beams and rafters, curling in the corners like some slow, damp beast. Hay in the barns turned gray. Firewood refused to dry, and when the first frost came in late October, it sealed the misery in a coffin of ice. That winter, the people of Eslan learned what it meant to fear the sky. They rationed, of course. Every home had some measure of grain or salted root stored away. But rot does not respect walls. What had once been food spoiled under the constant damp. Sacks of flour were found clumped and crawling. Barrels leaked brine. Mice gnawed through the softer stores. And so the villagers began to share, not out of charity, but out of necessity. The rich gave little, the poor gave what they could, and those who had nothing traded silence for the right to sit closer to the fire. By mid-November, the baker's oven went cold. No one came with grain to grind, no one with yeast to rise. The smell of bread, once the scent of comfort, was now a memory that floated like smoke through the dreams of children. Instead, meals became experiments, boiled roots too bitter to swallow, thistle tea, bark shavings, moss scraped from north-facing stones. When a child in the southern cottage fell ill from spoiled lentils, the mother swore she could hear the sickness moving in his belly like a second heartbeat. She did not scream when he died. She did not weep. She simply lay beside him until morning, holding his hand and whispering the name he would not grow into. Still, they did not call it famine. To name a thing is to give it power. And so they kept speaking of hard times, a bad year, God's patience. The priest, Father Belric, told them to pray harder. That suffering was holy, that the rain would pass when their sins had been washed away. He did not say why the innocent were suffering most. He did not explain why the bell that once rang at midday now hung silent. Perhaps even God had turned his face away from Aslan. By the time December arrived, there were no more traders, no carts, no visitors from neighboring towns. The roads had become rivers of filth, and even the animals had begun to vanish. The pigeons no longer gathered on the steeple. The sparrows no longer sang. The cats, once fat and proud, grew gaunt and fierce-eyed. One morning, a young boy named Ulrich was caught trying to trap a dog with rope and bread soaked in ale. When asked what he meant to do with it, he said nothing. He only looked down and said he missed the taste of stew. Then came the first real snow. It did not fall in flakes, but in a sheet, slow, wet, suffocating. The roofs sagged under its weight. The barns groaned. The trees cracked like old bones. The world turned white, but not clean. The snow was laced with ash from a dozen dying hearths and mud from the churned roads. It did not sparkle. It choked. And under that snow, in 100 little rooms across the village, people huddled around bowls with nothing in them, pretending they were full. Mothers told stories about feasts. Fathers sang lullabies without melody. Children closed their eyes and tried to remember what apples tasted like. And above it all, the rain still whispered in the frozen wind, soft, ceaseless, and cruel. That was the winter when the rain forgot to end. By the turning of the year, the people of Aslan no longer spoke of hunger as a stranger. It had become a guest in every home, uninvited yet never asked to leave. Hunger did not arrive with noise or panic. It slipped in quietly, taking first the softness from cheeks, then the color from lips, and finally, the light from eyes. It was not dramatic. It was not even cruel. It was methodical. The baker's house, once filled with the yeasty perfume of rising loaves and the cheerful clatter of wooden trays, now stood still. The great stone oven that had warmed half the village in years past sat dormant, cold to the touch, its mouth gaping like an empty tomb. The baker himself, a thick-handed man once known for his laugh, now moved through his home like a ghost, opening drawers only to find mouse droppings and crumbled dust. He no longer measured flour. He measured silence. In the homes nearby, mothers began to lie. "This is a feast," they whispered as they stirred pots filled with hot water and little else. "The nobles in the castle don't eat like this." Children learned not to ask for seconds. They learned not to cry when the spoon scraped only the bottom of the bowl. Hunger taught them that noise wasted strength. Hunger taught them not to dream during the day, because dreaming meant remembering. And remembering meant pain. Soon, new customs emerged. When a rat was caught, it was not spoken of. It was cleaned in secret, roasted with herbs if there were any left, and eaten beneath blankets with mouths closed tight. When bones were found buried near the edge of the churchyard, old, forgotten ribs and knuckle joints from generations past, they were not treated as relics. They were boiled, twice, thrice, until even the marrow surrendered. No one kept track of what was sacred anymore. Belts grew shorter, not from fashion, but from cutting. Pieces of leather were sliced and soaked in water until soft enough to chew. It was not food. It offered no nourishment, but it gave the jaw something to do. And sometimes, that was enough to fool the mind. Those who had old boots became envied. Those with nothing left were envied less. They were simply feared. Fear was another thing that spread without sound. It passed between neighbors when one grew too thin too quickly. It traveled through glances at the well, where once gossip had lived. It crept into the church, where prayers for mercy grew fewer and more desperate, until even Father Belric began to hesitate between words, as though afraid that speaking aloud might draw death closer. And then there were the whispers, not of plague or of war, but of things unspoken. A rumor of a woman in the South Cottage who had baked a pie that smelled too rich for the times. A rumor that the pie had no fruit. A rumor that a child had gone missing. No one dared ask her. No one confronted her. They simply stopped looking her in the eye. Hunger does not simply take food. It takes judgment. It takes the lines people draw between right and wrong and blurs them until all that is left is gray. It makes sin a matter of timing. It makes shame a matter of survival. The Lord of the land, Sir Edric, sent no aid, whether from cruelty or ignorance. No one knew. His manor stood high and dry atop the southern ridge, and smoke still rose from his chimney. Some believed his stores were full. Some believed they too would run dry in time. A few young men plotted to take what they could. They never returned. Their names were remembered for a while. Then they were not. One boy, Tomas, was caught stealing from the manor's midden heap. He had crept in at dawn to collect potato skins, apple cores, anything half-rotten but not yet mold-ridden. He was 12. The steward's men caught him with a crust of bread soaked through with wine dregs and dragged him through the village with a rope around his waist. They did not hang him. They tied his ankles and suspended him from the old cider press in the square, upside down. Arms dangling, eyes open and unfocused, he hung there for hours, blood rushing to his face, until his lips turned purple and his nose bled onto the cobbles. The villagers watched, not because they wanted to, but because they could not look away. What they saw in the boy was not guilt, nor crime. They saw themselves, just a few days, a few meals, a few moral compromises removed. When they finally cut him down, Tomas said nothing. He only curled into a ball on the ground and trembled, his crust of bread still clutched in his fist. A week later, the baker's wife, Marta, lost her infant to fever. She did not scream. She did not bury the child in the frozen churchyard. Instead, she wrapped the tiny body in swaddling cloth and placed it gently inside the cold oven where her husband had once baked wedding bread and saint cakes. "It's the warmest place I can give her," she said, and no one judged her. Not even God, it seemed. At the very edge of Eslin, where the last of the cottages gave way to tangled woods and moss-heavy stone, lived a woman the villagers called Old May. No one remembered her true name, not even she. Perhaps, but everyone remembered her hands. They were brown as walnut shells, lined like riverbeds, and smelled always of lavender, garlic, or the faint iron of dried blood. Once, she had been the healer, the herb wife, the woman who whispered charms over birthing bowls and burned rosemary to keep death from cradles. Now, she was simply old, a crooked shape beneath a woolen shawl, with eyes sharp as frost and voice soft as honeyed milk gone sour. Her cottage was a place children once ran to when they scraped their knees or caught fevers. Now, they came not for salves, but for stories. Not all children, only the few who still had the strength to walk, and the ones whose mothers dared to hope that dreams might nourish more than broth could. Inside May's hearth, long since too weak to burn more than twigs and windfall, there had once hung a wooden rack above the fire, upon which she dried apple slices every autumn, thin as coins, amber gold, translucent in firelight. The slices had a perfume that drifted through the room like a promise. She would give them to coughing babies, to weeping widows, and to lovers who feared the cold would outlast their vows. The apples came from a crooked little tree behind her cottage, gnarled and stooped like herself, but unfailingly loyal each year. That tree bore no fruit now. Its limbs, heavy with lichen, reached out as if in supplication to a sun that never came. The last apple had fallen months ago, green and malformed, devoured by a raven before May could reach it. Still, she told her stories. She would gather the children around what remained of her hearth, cover them in old wool blankets, and speak of things that once were, or might be again. She spoke of orchards so full that the trees bent in exhaustion beneath the weight of their gifts, of pies with crusts so crisp they cracked like snow underfoot, of cider warm as a hug, of cheeks sticky with juice, of autumns where the only tears were from laughter. They were red like fire, she said of her apples, and round like promises not yet broken. When you bit into them, they spoke to your tongue in a language older than prayer. The children listened, some closed their eyes, some mouthed the words along with her, as if reciting spells. Others simply sat still, faces hollow, hungry not just for food, but for a taste of something more than survival. May never lied to them. She never said the apples would return. But she did say this: "If you dream hard enough," she whispered, "you can smell the orchard again. If your belly is quiet, your heart can remember the sound the leaves made when the wind danced through the branches." One boy, Joran, dreamed so vividly one night that he woke up chewing his own sleeve. He said the apple had been crisp and cool, and when he bit it, he heard birds singing. That was the last time he spoke before his fever took him 3 days later. They wrapped him in the same blanket May had given him, and May wept, not for the boy, but for the orchard he never really saw. For the adults, May's tales were foolishness, useless, sentimental, but none forbade their children from going. In truth, they were grateful, if only for a few hours of peace. A few hours when a child's stomach forgot to groan, when pale lips curved upward in something that almost resembled joy. As for May, she gave all she had. When the firewood ran out, she tore up her own chairs for kindling. When her herbs were gone, she soaked dried leaves in snowmelt and told the children it was apple tea. When even her strength began to fail, she lay down on her bed of straw and looked out the window toward her tree. There was no fruit on its branches, only snow, but still, she whispered to the dark. They chewed leather and dreamed of apples. And in those dreams, they lived a little longer. By the depth of that winter, hunger no longer whispered in Eslan. It shouted, but its voice did not echo through the streets in wails or cries. It rang in quieter ways, in the silence that fell when a bowl was passed but not refilled. In the way a father turned his back so his children could not see him measure the last of the oats. In the glances exchanged when a neighbor's fire burned just a little too brightly. And no one asked why. There was food still, in places, a hidden crust, a heel of cheese, a handful of lentils buried deep within a sack. But food was not shared now. Not openly, not proudly. It was hoarded, hidden, protected like a sleeping infant. Those who once hosted feasts now drew curtains tight and locked their doors with trembling hands. Those who still had livestock, an old hen, a goat that no longer gave milk, became targets of both envy and suspicion. A cluck heard through the snow might lead to a knock in the night, or a stone through the window, or worse. It was then that shame took root, deeper than hunger, more enduring than frost. Tomas was the first. He was 12, the youngest of 5 sons born to a weaver who had already buried 2. His mother had not spoken since the last boy passed. His father sat for hours each day, staring at the loom he could no longer use, his fingers too stiff from cold, his thread too damp to catch. So Tomas did what boys in desperate times always do. He went where he was not supposed to go. The manor house of Sir Edric, perched on the southern ridge above Eslan, had always loomed like a stone god, watchful, aloof, untouched by the suffering below. Rumors had long swirled that its cellars were still full, that the Lord's stores had been sealed tight before the rains began. Some said Sir Edric still dined on meat, that his wife drank wine, that their dogs were better fed than the children in the village. Tomas did not care for rumor. He cared only for what he saw behind the kitchen yard, a slop bucket, half filled with peelings, bones, and spoiled scraps. To him, it was a banquet. He waited until dawn, crept through snowbanks, climbed the low hedge. His fingers shook as he reached into the bucket. He found a hunk of bread, half molded. He bit into it before he could even look around. They caught him before he could run. The steward's men, broad, red-cheeked, wearing furs that smelled of wood smoke and meat, dragged him down the hill. Not gently, they tied his wrists, jeered as he stumbled, and brought him to the village square. There, beneath the old cider press, they tied him by the ankles and hoisted him upside down. His face flushed red, then purple. Blood dripped from his nose. The bread still clutched in his hand. No one stopped them. The villagers gathered, not out of cruelty, not even out of curiosity, but because they needed to see, needed to witness that there was still a line. That hunger, though relentless, could still be punished. They needed to believe that something, anything, was still in order. When Tomas was finally lowered, he did not speak. He curled into himself and lay still. His mother came and took him home without a word. The next morning, the bread was gone. No one asked where. 3 nights later, another shame bloomed in silence. Marta, the baker's wife, gave birth in the dark of early morning. The child, her 3rd in 5 years, did not cry. It gasped once, then fell still. Fever had claimed her too soon. Marta wrapped the child in a flour sack and held her to her breast until the heat of her body was no longer enough. She did not take the infant to the graveyard. The earth was frozen too hard to dig, and the priest had no more candles for blessing. Instead, she went to the cold oven in the corner of their cottage. The same oven where loaves had once risen tall and golden, where wedding cakes had been baked, where villagers used to gather to exchange gossip and warm their hands. She laid her child inside. Gently, reverently, she did not light a fire. When her husband asked her why, she said only, "It's the warmest place she'll ever know." No one spoke of it the next day, not because they disapproved, but because to speak would be to break the fragile shell that kept them from doing the same. Thus hunger fed on more than flesh. It consumed pride. It devoured dignity. It blurred the boundaries between good and evil, between mercy and madness, and in its shadow, silence became the last form of kindness. The snow had fallen and stayed. It coated the roofs, the fields, the trees, and the hearts of those still left in Eslin. By March, even the hunger had changed. It no longer screamed, it whispered, a dull ache behind the ribs, a slow fog behind the eyes. People did not collapse in the street, not often, but they moved slower, spoke softer, and forgot things they had once remembered with ease. And then, without warning, the rain stopped. It did not end with a sunrise or a celebration. It simply ceased. The gray skies remained, but the sound, the eternal drip, the endless patter, faded. The silence was not relief. It was strange, foreign, unsettling, like walking into a familiar room and realizing something sacred was missing. The snow, untouched by further rain, hardened into crust. Trees stood like ghosts, their branches etched with frost. Smoke rose in thin, barely visible threads from cottages where firewood had run out weeks ago. There were fewer footprints in the snow now, fewer voices, fewer signs of life. And then came the girl. No one saw where she came from. Some said she wandered out of the forest. Others claimed she'd always lived in Eslin, the youngest daughter of a family too quiet to notice. But on that pale morning, as villagers huddled in their homes waiting for death or spring, whichever arrived first, a small child walked barefoot into the village square. Her dress was too thin, her skin too pale, her breath came in little clouds that vanished before they could rise. But in her cupped hands, nestled like a secret, was an apple. Not a carving, not a painted rock, a real apple. It was not large, its skin was bruised and uneven. A wormhole curled along the top like a question. But it was unmistakably, impossibly real, and red, not gray, not brown, red, the kind of red that only exists in memory and myth. She did not speak. She held it out, eyes wide, as if afraid that even mentioning it aloud might break the spell. The villagers emerged one by one, like animals lured from their dens. They came not with pitchforks or shouts, but with reverence. A woman dropped to her knees. A man covered his mouth with both hands. Someone began to cry, loudly, uncontrollably, like a dam breaking after too long held back. When asked where it had come from, the girl pointed toward the mill. "There's a tree," she whispered, "behind the stones. It bloomed too early. Only one branch, only one apple." No one ran to the tree. No one checked to see if there were more. Instead, they did what they had not done in months. They went to the church. Father Belric cleared the dust from the altar with trembling hands. He lit the last stub of candle and placed it in the iron ring. The girl stepped forward, climbed the 2 stone steps, and set the apple down gently as if laying an infant to rest. They did not eat it. They could have. Every mouth in that room ached to bite into it. Every stomach churned with memory. But no one reached. No one dared. To eat it would be to destroy the one thing that had not been taken, hope. Instead, they gathered every day to look at it, to sit in silence and simply see it. The apple did not rot. It sat there, stubbornly defiant, bright, round, whole. It became a relic, a symbol, a kind of truth. For in that apple, they remembered what sweetness tasted like. Children came to stare at it the way they once stared at stars. Old men bowed before it, whispering the names of those who had gone. Mothers knelt beside it and said nothing, letting their tears fall not from pain, but from remembering how it felt to believe. The girl was not seen again. Some say she returned to the forest. Some say she never existed at all. But the apple remained, and when the first green blade of grass broke through the snow in late April, it was still there, untouched, unspoiled. They could have eaten it then, but they didn't, because by then, they understood. That apple had already fed them in the only way that mattered. Spring did return. It came not with trumpets, not with blossoms bursting open like promises kept, but with silence, the kind of silence that does not follow grief, but follows survival. The rain did not fall again. The snow melted, slow and muddy. The wind turned warmer, though still sharp. The trees, hesitant at first, began to bud, and the soil, exhausted, sour, yet still alive, gave itself once more to seed. In the village of Eslin, the people emerged from their homes like creatures after hibernation, blinking at the brightness of day. Many had not spoken in weeks. Many had lost the weight of not just flesh, but memory. They walked slowly, spoke little, but they moved, and that, in itself, was a kind of resurrection. The famine passed, as all things must. The rains ceased, the sun returned, and the harvests, smaller, more cautious, began again. But some things did not return. The baker's laughter, once the sound of morning, never came back. His wife no longer sang while sweeping the doorway. Father Belric still prayed, but his voice had taken on a softness that spoke not of faith, but of having seen too much. And old May's house stood empty, her apple tree blooming in silence. The girl was never found. The orchard behind the mill yielded no more miracles. The apple, dried and darkened, was eventually removed from the altar, though no one could say exactly when. In its place, a single wooden carving was left, crude, small, shaped by unsure hands, but it was red, painted with the last of the elderberries, bright and defiant, and a tradition began. Each year, just before the final snows, the villagers would place one apple on the altar, real, if possible, carved. If not, it was not for eating. It was not for prayer. It was for remembering, because the famine had taught them that the body can survive many things: leather, bark, silence, but the soul needs sweetness, not just on the tongue, but in the mind, a sweetness that reminds it of why survival matters. The children who had once sat at May's hearth grew old. They taught their own children not just how to till the land or store grain, but how to tell stories. Of the year the rain did not stop, of the meals made from moss, of the boy who hung from the cider press, of the woman who buried her child in an oven, of the girl with the apple. And in those stories, the hunger lived on, not as a wound, but as a lesson. They learned that suffering is not always loud, that dignity is fragile, that hope is not always something one holds, but sometimes only something one sees, from across the room, sitting on an altar, glowing red in a room full of gray. Years later, when strangers passed through Eslin and asked about the carved apple in the chapel window, the villagers would smile, nod, and say only, "There was a time we chewed leather and dreamed of apples." That was enough, and that's why we remember. In every age, there comes a moment when survival asks more of the spirit than of the flesh. In Eslin, that moment came with rain, and yet, they endured, not with swords or sermons, but with memory, with dreams, with a single apple placed on an altar, untouched, because sometimes, to remember sweetness is enough to survive bitterness. And so we remember, not because we hunger now, but because one day, we might. The Medieval Vault, where forgotten lives speak again. Subscribe for more stories that history books left behind.